In 1981, when I was entering high school, I convinced my parents to buy me a TRS-80 color computer from Radio Shack. I was able to connect it to a 13-inch color television in my bedroom, and it came with a cassette recorder so that I could save and load programs, and it included some crummy joysticks. I bought and played a few video games on it, but I was never really into video games. I was far more interested in creating my own programs. Thankfully, Radio Shack bundled two great books on the basic programming language with the computer. I worked my way through them, learning how to code. My best friend in high school and college was Jeff Silver. In high school, when we weren't playing Dungeons and Dragons, we were programming my computer. I was a huge Star Trek fan, having watched reruns of the original series every weekday afternoon throughout elementary school. The movie Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan premiered in the summer of 1982. I was intrigued by the movie's graphical depiction of the ship raising its shields. The old TV show had never had that sort of thing. That led me to write 15 Star Trek programs, until I left for college in 1984. I wrote about half of them on my own, and about half in collaboration with Jeff, and I sold off my color computer in 1988. At that time, I decided to preserve the Star Trek programs by running them a final time with the television connected to a video cassette recorder. I've digitized the old videotape so that I can show you our programs and how our skills and ambitions evolved from 1982 to 1984. I regret that Jeff can't help me narrate this video as he passed away in 2018. This video is dedicated to his memory. So here's the beginning of the videotape that Jeff and I made in 1988. M&S Productions, that's Metter and Silver Productions. If we'd still been in junior high, we might have called it S&M Productions, but we were too mature for that. And we're presenting to you the Color Computer Graphics Archives. Now, we had to write a special basic program just to make these two entry slides, and that's because the native text mode on a color computer was a really hideous 32 by 16 screen with a green background and black lettering. So we used it sometimes in different variations in our programs, but other times we would resort to hand coding in BASIC out the various letter forms and shapes we wanted. So the first program I wrote about Star Trek was just to put an image of the Enterprise on the screen with a planet. But I'm no artist, so I had a 256 by 192 grid that I'd gotten out of my basic programming book for the computer, and somehow I had to draw the Enterprise on there. Thankfully, in 1975, my parents had bought for me the Starfleet Technical Manual. It was a book by Franz Joseph that was just full of wonderful diagrams and schematics, and that included some key images of the Enterprise. So I flipped the grid over and traced the shape onto it of the Enterprise from one of the pages in the technical manual. And then I flipped the sheet of paper back over and I could fill in on the grid, pixel by pixel, the image I wanted to form. And that then would give me the coordinates I would need to instruct the computer on where to draw each line segment in order to form the Enterprise. And then the planet could be quickly done by just drawing a circular shape with a circle command and filling that in with a paint command. So here's the first Star Trek program I wrote, and it just draws the outline of the Enterprise and draws the edge of a planet and slowly fills it in with a paint command. The image here is the highest resolution the computer offered, 256 by 192, and it was only a two-color mode, so only black and white. But because of how the signal was put out to a television, it would create kind of these blue and orange or red lines in some areas, and that's called artifacting. And that was a trick I eventually learned to use in a few programs to add a couple more colors to the high-resolution mode. One thing you also might notice is the Enterprise is left-right reversed here from what I'd drawn on the grid, and that's because there was a command in BASIC called draw that lets you pick a starting point and then draw the outline relative to that, and that meant I could more easily shift the ship around without having to replot every coordinate, which I was grateful for. And with program number 2, Jeff helped me out. He said, let's draw the Enterprise like you did, let's fill it in with the paint command, and now let's do an overhead view of the Enterprise. And then he helped me work out how to use keystrokes to turn on and off the shield dots around the edges of the ship, like I had seen happen in the Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Another keystroke would turn them off, and then Jeff had an idea about, let's blow up the ship. And so there was a randomized program that would randomly fill in dots on the screen. And if it happened to fill in a dot right on top of an impulse engine, it would blow up the ship. And we represented that by just showing a circular image that came out of the center of the screen. And we got that idea from the programming manual. The programming manual that came with the computer had various sample programs, and one was called Time Bomb. And it had this image in the manual that showed this kind of explosion-looking effect made from circles. So we looked into that sample program number 18 and figured out how it worked, and used that to make the little circles for our exploding Enterprise. I wanted to demonstrate how we did the explosion effect, but I haven't had a color computer in 35 years. Well, the internet to the rescue. You can just run a Coco 2 emulator in a web browser. And so I input this program you see on the screen, which has clear the screen, set the mode for the resolution and the colors, and then just draw a series of circles, and then draw another set of circles in reverse, getting smaller with set to black color and elliptical shape. And then a little example of how we did lettering, just a few line segment commands that would draw an S. And so I'll run that here on this emulator for you. And you can see there's the first circle being drawn over and over, getting bigger and bigger. And then in a second we'll see the black circles or ellipses being formed and getting smaller. And then the commands will draw an S. There we go on the screen. So that's how this was done in BASIC. Over time, our computer programs became hundreds of lines of code, much more elaborate, and a couple had to be split in parts because they overwhelmed the computer's memory. The computer back in 1982 only had 32 kilobytes of RAM, and to put that in perspective, a photo on a smartphone in 2023 takes up about 150 times more memory space than our computer had. The next program I did on my own, and one thing I had learned was the scale command in BASIC with the draw function so that you could take a drawing and scale it to different degrees. And so I made it where you could press different keys and scale up the saucer section of the ship, or scale up the secondary hull, or hit another key and scale up an engine nacelle. And that was kind of interesting to do, but it was kind of boring just to do that. So then I decided, let's try and make a little battle. And so I made the sequence of events of, phaser bursts and explosions with my little circle command. But one thing that bothered me about this was that when I'd use the dark circles to get rid of the explosions, there was a delay before I could draw in the new outline of the ship from the battle damage. And so that was disconcerting. I wish there was a way to fix that, and I would later figure out some solutions. And so here you can see, I'm starting to really play around with the circles. And so we're slowly getting rid of that engine nacelle here. I'm waiting to fill in the battle damage. There we go. And then the Enterprise is, using its rather strange behaving phasers there to destroy an unseen enemy. Unseen, of course, because my artistic skills were so low, I couldn't draw another ship very well. And so that was fun. And then, having done that little battle sequence, I decided, well, let's just blow up the ship. That'd be a good excuse to kind of play with the different circles and see the moire patterns that you could get. So I have a series of circles here and then stepping them different degrees to kind of blow the ship apart. And having done that, then it's like, well, let's just go for a full screen effect. And so just a big explosion. And one thing that was always a limit with the computer, of course, was it was pretty slow, especially having to do something in BASIC. that was always interpreted. There was no compiler on the computer to turn a basic program into a more fast operating executable file. So you can see here that, the explosions are nice, I guess, but they sure do take a while to get the screen to fill up. And then I started, playing with different steps of dark circles to get rid of that. And so at this point, it's really becoming more of an exercise in computer programming and learning how to do the different effects I wanted to accomplish. Oh my, it does take a while. After these kind of things, I would always, have Jeff come see what I'd done and invite my parents to come into the room and see what their son had been typing in to his computer for hours to make these different effects. For the next program, Jeff worked with me, and we decided we wanted to try and do something more with color and some sound. And so we took a diagram from the technical manual of a Type 1 hand phaser from the old Star Trek show and transferred that onto a worksheet. And even though we used a high resolution worksheet, we decided to get more colors. We would actually use a lower resolution mode. And so we gave ourselves credit this time on the program, and here we're drawing it in a little bit less resolution, but we're able to get more colors. And we had the specifications on the phaser on the screen using the basic text mode of the computer. But then you could press different keys and activate different levels of the device. So when you press a key, you get a different color, a beam, and a different style of beam coming out of the front of the phaser. And then when we wanted to try and play around with color, we decided to do an overload. So when you hit the overload switch, the button would go, and then there you hear it, a continuously rising tone from the computer. It had pretty basic sound capabilities, but it could do that. And yeah, that's getting annoying. And then once it hit the top, there's kind of a warning that things are about to go bad, and then we actually tacked on a kaleidoscope program that we'd written and just put warp in the middle, and we laughed about the pretty terrible sound effect for that. Well, we'd done the Type 1 phaser, so we had to do the Type 2. And in the original series of Star Trek, the little hand phaser Type 1 snaps into a pistol grip to become a more powerful Type 2 phaser. So we got the diagram for the Type 2 phaser from the technical manual, and I traced that onto our sheet. And it was clear that we needed to go to full resolution mode for this to get all the little fine details to show up on screen. So when we went back around, we kept it in the higher resolution black and white 256 by 192 mode, particularly for the front end where you have what's called the photon accelerator, which would have lots of nice detail that we could show there. And here we go. So we've got our text introduction again, and then we've drawn the details in black and white, and here's the specs on the phaser. And just like the other program, you could hit different keys to start out in stun or heat and work your way up to disintegrate. And since we didn't have colors to play with, we just had a little kind of light on the back setting show up, and then you can, if you look closely, you'll see that the beam out of the front is changing at the different levels. And then of course we gotta have an overload setting, right? So there we go. And the actual overload, you would twist that front to trigger it. And so here we go. There's the sound effect again. And so we didn't want to do the pathetic little kaleidoscope program at the end. So this time we tried to switch modes, because we knew that would distort the computer screen from things we'd tried. And so here we got some random sounds. And then, oh dear, what does that mean is going to happen? We're just going to paint the rest of this and then switch modes, make some weird things happen on the screen, and then just clear the screen in a bunch of colors as if that was some kind of massive explosion, I suppose, that's happening. The next program I did on my own, and we'd realized that the computer could play sounds and still draw at the same time. So I took a Shuttlecraft from the technical manual, transferred that onto a sheet, and put that in to a program. Now the hull registry numbers were too complicated to do, so I left those out. But here's my little program. There you can see the phasers can actually make sounds now, and some engine noises. So that was a fun little experiment that I made. So for our next go-around, Jeff was working with me, and we decided to call ourselves M&S Productions for the first time. And so we have that credit. And then we're bringing in the Tholians, which had appeared in one episode of the old series as an enemy. And we again have pretty similar effects to what we'd already been playing with. The big innovation in this program was coming up with this pulsing kind of tilted course torpedo effect. We were very proud of figuring out how to make that happen. And then we have an off-screen explosion of the Tholians are destroyed. But, of course, they're going to get their revenge. Another ship will come along and build a web. And the Tholian web is something that if it was completed, the ship would be absorbed in interface. And that part there is just interference on this old recording, not part of the program. Our web was so sophisticated it was just a rectangle. And then we wanted the ship to disappear, and so we just made it slowly disappear using these black ellipses. And that was one of the frustrations with the computer, was that it ran so slowly in BASIC that things like this just took forever to make something disappear off the screen in this manner. And so we were looking for ways to improve on that. But that's what we could do. And this is a case of our ambitions exceeding our abilities. I'll show you a sketch here after the end of, we originally planned to have a view screen on the shown with the little lights blinking below and a Tholian ship in the middle. And we just weren't able to pull that off in a manner that was acceptable at the time. Later I reused this, and we did pull off a screen effect with some Klingons instead of Tholians. But that's still a few programs away before we get to that level. The next outing was done without Jeff, and it was me playing around with Klingons again. So I decided to try and have a battle between a Klingon ship and a Federation destroyer rather than the Enterprise. And so you can see, you know, we've got the little explosions and beams and so forth. Still have that problem of damage not getting filled in until after the explosion's done. We've got a little weakening of power on that beam, trying to do some new innovations. And there we see the modified version of that torpedo effect that we had figured out in the previous program. And then this is just a long exercise of, once again, me getting a little bit carried away with all of my ellipses. Just having fun making these different explosive effects appear and then gradually disappear. And as if that wasn't bad enough, okay, now we're going to blow up the nacelle on the destroyer, and evidently that was bad enough to just blow everything up. And so you can see that not a whole lot of innovation actually in this program, just kind of playing around with some tropes that we'd already figured out. So I must have been feeling guilty toward the end about the fact that it wasn't all that innovative. So I decided to try and do something different and create a pulsar, something pulsing on the screen. And so I wiped that debris field out very quickly and then drew these lines and drew them and redrew them as they slowly eat away this other ship and then start pulsing. And so that's just me, you know, trying to do something a little different in the program that we hadn't seen before. And so, yep, there we've got a nice little pulsar. So the next outing was back with Jeff, and one innovation we had was that we made ourselves a title card for M&S Productions rather than using text mode. And that's the same title card we would use years later when making the archive. But the big innovation with this program about the Reliant, which was a ship from Wrath of Khan, is that we had text on the screen for the person to read, and what was happening in the background was that the ship and the planet were being drawn so that we could rapidly switch and already have the ship on screen and not watch it being drawn. So that was our big innovation with this program. Then we have our usual, various battle sequences that we'd worked out how to do things, including our torpedo effect. And we have another explosion off screen. But then we had one more little innovation, and that was that we would have a second torpedo launched and have the enemy blow it up mid-course. And then here we're rapidly switching the mode on the computer, which causes this kind of interference pattern effect. And we liked that because that would be like the drone picking up interference from the explosion. And then we wrap it up with, more explosions and my love of ellipses. And here, this time I'll get a little carried away with a big circle that I erase at the end, and getting rid of it leaves kind of a moire pattern that I said, well, that's the debris field of the ship. But then it bled over onto the planet in the picture, and I said, well, that's just a scar on the planet left by the explosion of the ship. We were still learning some new things. Jeff always helped push me to do more. And so the next program after this one is where we'd really get ambitious. It would be a 10-minute, two-parter movie. And we would take on several effects that we hadn't been able to achieve before. Okay, it's time for the big two-parter that Jeff and I worked on, and we had learned some new tricks that we put to use. Now, we have M&S Productions as text there rather than that fancy new graphic we'd used in the previous program because we were really straining the computer's memory with this effort, so we decided to not put that fancier title card, but instead put this animated Star Trek title, where we'd have the ship fire, create an explosion, and then have Star Trek appear from the explosion. So that was a fun thing to figure out. And then we introduce our cast of characters, the Enterprise and Farragut, and if you notice, the ships just appeared there kind of top to bottom. They weren't drawn, and that's because we had discovered a new way to get things onto the screen and kind of block them into place. And so that was a new innovation as well. We had ships firing again, things happening in the background, but this time we had shield effects. So when a beam hits the ship, it would be blocked. And here you can see us using that new way of making things appear so that we could have them kind of warp in and out of existence. And Jeff came up with that folding engine design on the back of the ship, which was a really neat touch. And then we were trying our different tricks here, and then when the ship fires on that weird pattern there is an error the computer would make when you shifted things off screen in a certain way. And we said, well, we can turn that into a ship being destroyed. So we were using the computer's own limitations as something to be creative with. Anytime there's a lot of text on the screen, you know something's being drawn in the background. Here we have Starfleet headquarters and the Enterprise warping out with that new effect we'd learned. And you may have noticed for the first time there were stars patterns on the screen. And that was fun to do, but it also meant that we had to explain why we didn't have star patterns in every image we had throughout the rest of our little show. So we have little excuses. And here's one that we'd been working on a while, how to make a view screen. So we had it build the planet in the background, and then it had this animated view screen effect like on the old Star Trek show. So we were proud of that we'd finally gotten that to work. And now we're going to go to a computer simulation of the ship firing on targets on the planet. And the reason we used that language was because we didn't want to try and do the star pattern here. That would be too complex for us to dodge all those stars when we're drawing lines for the phaser beams and so on. So we came up with some verbiage to explain why suddenly there are no stars, even though there were stars in a previous picture. And now we're having fun just doing explosions again, firing at targets on the planet, and leaving scars, having built on that idea of we could leave a scar behind on a planet. And this goes on for a while. I'm not sure what the point was, just having fun. But then we'll have some more innovation here coming up. Oh, red alert, and we're switching text modes here. And then you know there's something being built in the background again because we're having text on the screen for you to read as part of our adventure. And what actually is being built is the planet on the view screen is being built in the background. And we would show that and then immediately start switching modes as if the ship was warping out of space, and so makes these weird effects. But there we had a planet drawn and stars and the view screen, so we were again proud of the fact that we'd pulled that off. And then we have our warping effect, more verbiage before this explaining why there's no stars, the folding engine, firing and hitting shields on the other ship, and oops, they got through the shields on the Enterprise, causing some damage there. And then the Enterprise will use its fancy beam. But then, a new innovation here as well. We had learned how to make arcs. And so we had worked out the mathematics of drawing these concentric arcs and limiting their scope so that they would just be enough for this plasma weapon, as we thought of it, to come up and destroy the Farragut or the Enterprise, whichever one it was. Probably the Farragut, and then have it slowly dissolve. And that's inspired by one of my favorite episodes of the old show, Balance of Terror, where the Romulans had a plasma weapon that threatened the ship. And so that was a really fun thing to figure out how to do those arcs and these warp effects so the ship would warp out of space. But we really were pushing the computer much harder than we had with these more elaborate sequences. And so we were starting to run low on memory. This computer only had 32 kilobytes of RAM. And so we could afford to do one more shot of the Enterprise with some stars and have the Enterprise warp out. But then we were out of memory. So you had to stop and load in the second part of the program. And then when it start, have a little sound effect. Another little innovation here, when you're finished reading the text, hit the spacebar so that we're not trying to time the text all the time. And of course, we're still using the text as a screen for some background drawing that's happening that you can't see until we switch it in. And so what's being drawn in the background while we were waiting? Okay, a star pattern and the Enterprise is warping in to the screen. So again, a new thing we hadn't done before. And here's something we were playing with, and that was playing with the Mori patterns created by line segments done sequentially. And so we built this kind of schematic of what we called the sensor grid or sensor field of the ship and how intense it was scanning. And so that was kind of a fun thing to code. And then one innovation that was kind of a hidden message for Star Trek fans was that if you had all of these different sensor scan beam patterns shown at once, it would make a very particular shape. And so you can see here we're getting the overlapping Mori patterns as we draw these line segments. And when they all work together, they form a shape around the ship that's the form of a chevron. And that is the shape of the shield that the Enterprise crew members wore on their shirts. And now is the shape of the emblem used for the U.S. Space Force these days. And we've got a red alert going, again changing to a different text mode, having some fun with that. And I'm sure we're disguising some background graphics drawing of that alien ship so that we can then warp it in and have it fold up its engines. There we go, with that effect that Jeff had worked out. And then looks like the Enterprise caught them without their shields up. And then they're trying to bust through our shields. And we're going to shoot a torpedo at them. That'll teach them a lesson. And again, our new arc effect. So we're showing that the torpedo was used to hit their shields, and that would neutralize their shields. And then they try and use their plasma weapon again. We're playing around with the arc effect, but we'll interrupt it with phaser fire and blow up that plasma weapon before it can reach the Enterprise. And so, having fun with our newfound abilities and taking things farther than we had before. And so, let's see what's next. We're going to slowly clear that debris field with the usual circles and ellipses, and then fire a new kind of beam, and then we're going to have a totally different effect to wipe out the ship. Yeah, there we go. More playing around with these line patterns like we'd use for the sensor sweeps to create a new effect. And so that was a lot of fun to put together, but a lot of work. About 10 minutes of screen time and coding 2 full programs that push the computer's memory to its limits. The big two-parter had been a stretch for Jeff and me, especially since the computer was trapped at my house. And so we only collaborated on one more Star Trek program after that, instead spending our time doing Dungeons & Dragons and other things. But that wasn't the end of Star Trek for me by any means, and so as a super fan, I made something I called the Enterprise specifications, and this was by Omega Productions, which was my name for my own little productions that I'd come up with. And the idea here was that I wanted to design a version of an Enterprise starship. And my parents had bought me that technical manual when I was about 9 years old, and I didn't know that at the same time Franz Joseph had put out full-scale blueprints of all the decks of the Enterprise. I didn't know such a thing existed. So I had to kind of imagine what a ship might have in it with just pieces of it shown in the technical manual. And so I went through and decided to design my own little Enterprise that wasn't quite so complex. And I put some of it on the computer. And so here we're going to see a demonstration of phaser firing angles from my version of an Enterprise. And then it's going to show you, since I knew how to draw a torpedo firing path, and that's definitely shows an influence from the Star Trek movies. That's where the torpedoes came out in the movies, but not in the TV show. And then let's see, what next are we going to illustrate? The ramjet scoop angle, and this is very different from any of the real Star Trek things. I was into Larry Niven's books where they had ramjets that scooped up hydrogen, and so I put that on the front instead of a deflector dish, even though in the real, so-called real Enterprise, there are kind of ramjet scoops or Bussard collectors on the front of the warp engines. And if none of that means anything to you, it's okay. And then tractor beams and transporter beams, and what else we're going to show you here? Shielding perimeters. So we'll look at minimum and maximum shielding. And as you might guess, if I'm going to do some shields, I'm going to get an ellipse in here. And so boom, there we go. The maximum shielding, it forms an ellipse. And because I had taken the time to actually draw out all these decks of the Enterprise, I wanted to put it on a computer, but of course the resolution wasn't enough to do anything too detailed. So I just kind of showed where the decks were located in this side view of the ship and made a list of things that were on those decks in my drawings. And so it just works its way through deck by deck, showing what I imagined to be in the Enterprise. And like I said, in my drawings, they were not at all like the actual ship from the TV show. The bridge, the sick bay, all the different parts were laid out totally differently inside, because I wasn't trying to replicate what the show looked like. That was not my interest. I wanted to see, what if I were designing a Star Trek ship that was a little bit smaller, with about 60 people on board rather than 430, and what parts would it need to operate? And of course, this shows my nerdy interest and my fixation in physics and engineering to different degrees, in that I was thinking through all these mechanical systems. So that's one of the strengths of the Star Trek ship from the 60s, was that it was one of the first ships that you could imagine what different parts of the ship did, rather than just being some kind of flying saucer or some mysterious entity. And so it was more interesting for people like me that could think about, okay, power's generated here and transmitted to there to do this, and so on. And that's why you get super fans that have wars about, where is engineering located on the Enterprise? Is it in the primary hull where Franz Joseph showed it, or is it down in the secondary hull like in the movies? And those are just fun things for nerds to get into, as long as they can control their emotions. And so here we're still working our way through the ship, looking at the different parts of it. I'll show you at the end of this the actual drawings I made, which were unusually good for my limited artistic skill. I put a lot of effort into drawing these out on giant sheets of legal paper. Okay, we've made our way through the ship, so here's my drawings that program was based off. Here's my top view of the Enterprise that I'd come together with, and then some side views showing the different functions on the ship and some specifications, clearly heavily influenced by the technical manual. Here's some idea about shielding and then layouts and the different beams that I illustrated in the computer. And then here are my deck plans. And so deck by deck, how I would lay out where would you put these different functions? Where would you store the water? Where would you grow the food? What about the recreation facilities, the computer core, etc.? And then there's a giant ramjet on the front rather than a deflector dish to collect more interstellar hydrogen to help fuel the engines. And so that was a lot of fun to do and translate into a computer program. So here's another program, this one on my own again, so a few innovations in this one. It's Omega Productions, so I designed a little title card animated sequence for my little production company, since I was working on my own on this one. And there's the Enterprise again, the usual job, but using an effect we'd seen before where if you took a drawing and shifted it to off screen, the computer would error and distort it, using that to kind of make an animated Star Trek opening, and then sound effect of a torpedo. And then here's a new thing I'd worked out, how to make kind of a firework effect of these spinning dots that would then collapse into an explosion that would reveal the title of the episode. So still looking for some innovations and not just repeating everything that we had learned to do in BASIC in the previous months. And so here we're seeing we're going to have a Klingon Encounter in this episode. And so we're back to text mode and tell them they can hit the spacebar when they're through reading. Of course, in the background, we're drawing something. We're drawing a planet in this case with some landforms. And the low resolution of the computer means that we're doing it in the highest resolution mode, but we can only have two colors. So this one I decided to go with the green and black, which really is green and muddy green on the TVs of the time. And there it is. There's our planet, Orbis Alpha, with some stars around it. It took a while to draw. And here's some data on Orbis Alpha. I really don't know how reasonable those different numbers would be at first glance, but they might have been worked out to be not too ridiculous for a planet. Some kind of alert coming in. I have a feeling it'll be Klingons. And something's appearing over the horizon of the planet. We're going to zoom in and magnify, and at least do as best we can with this computer. And so we're waiting for it to draw that, I guess. And there we go. Oh yes, there is something in the planet. Oh my goodness, yes, it's a Klingon ship. And I don't think the planet is quite to scale in that zoom. And it's time for battle stations. We're going to go to our main screen for a battle log. And yeah, let's get rid of that muddy green look, please, and have something a little more attractive to look at. And once it finishes drawing, and there is the ship warping out. And this time you can see it turn blue. And this is where I was beginning to learn how to manipulate where you drew the lines to get the artifact colors, where you could get blue or orange or an orangey red in addition to just black and white. And so trying, some different things. And here's some weird effects on the planet view and then stars appearing. So that my idea there was that we've entered warp. And so much more of a point of view adventure, this one, where we're looking out from the view screen rather than watching the ship from the exterior like in many of the other programs. And so here's our battle screen. And so my big concept here was we're going to see us engage with the Klingons from our point of view. And so here we are firing on them, and they fire on us, and we get this interference on the screen when their weapons, their disruptors, strike the Enterprise. And then we're shooting a torpedo at them, and that'll hit their shields and show that with an arc and a circle that we've broken through their shields. And explain to the audience what's going to happen. We're going to try and destroy these Klingons, because what else would a teenager do? Talk? Forget it. Just hit them. And, oh, they struck us again, and that one really hurt. So, there we go. Now I'm more of like an explosion, like you might see in the movies, and actually moving part of the ship over to the side, because I had learned how to move shapes around in BASIC. And here's me again playing with that new ability to shift things that was a little different than the earlier types of shifts we had been able to do, by creating kind of well, I call it a warp effect. And so we're going to take the engine section of the Klingon ship and kind of wiggle it around, make kind of this warp effect, and then make some kind of cool inversion graphics. Just, having fun making some different graphical designs than what we'd seen previously, and then clearing that off the screen, getting some interference from that warp effect. And now we're going to tow the remains in. So I guess there were some people, some Klingons left alive, thank goodness. Okay, it's time for the last collaboration between Jeff and I on a Star Trek program, and this is Romulans. And so we have M&S Productions is back. And the reason this was possible is because this was in the summer of '84. We had graduated high school, and Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, was in the theaters, and that inspired us to do another adventure and try and be more three-dimensional and more sophisticated in the graphics we could do on the computer. So here we saw a different view of the ship than we'd had before, and a colorful explosion hitting the viewer, and then Star Trek Romulans. And one new thing here was that when the computer was busy in the background, it would display a backslash at the bottom of the screen to indicate it was still busy working on something, and when that backslash went away, that meant it was safe to hit the space bar and proceed. And so they've been drawing an Enterprise, so we get some stars back there, and we're worried about, we're near the neutral zone, and so maybe the Romulans would appear. And these would be the Romulans from the old series, because we had yet to see new style Romulans in later shows. And so we've got a Danubian trader ship. So again, much more sophisticated artwork in this final adventure we did together. And I'll show you at the end what the sources of some of those new graphics were that we utilized. And so there's a different kind of ship, some kind of a Danubian ship. And oh dear, it's headed toward us at a high speed and has explosives on board. So I have a feeling we'll have to destroy it. And again, something's being prepared in the background for us here. And then, oh dear, we've got trouble. What is going on? And oh dear, we don't have any phasers or torpedoes, and they're closing fast. So we better go to an exterior view using a ship's recorder, and we're drawing that. And yeah, there's our pretty new view of the Enterprise and the Danubian ship. And oh, we're going to fire on it, and we'll watch the Enterprise fire it. And then, of course, a much more elaborate explosion than just a bunch of circles like before, having to give it some trailing edges and then interference on the probe that's watching this encounter. So that was fun to put together. And who was up to that? Maybe the Romulans? Well, probably. From the title of the episode, I'd say seems likely. And something being prepared in the background. And all these graphics really did strain the computer's abilities. So we've got the Enterprise one more time, and we've got a Romulan appearing. And so we'll see if we have enough memory left in the computer to pull that off and have the Enterprise with a Romulan on the screen. Busy drawing that in the background. And once, there we go, now we can see it. Oh, okay, yet another view of the Enterprise, and more of a three-dimensional battle sequence there of firing on the Romulans. And we're warping out of the area. And so this, again, is our newfound ability to use artifact colors. So even though we're in high-res mode, we could turn the ship blue and kind of an orangey red. And that had exhausted the memory of the computer, so it was another two-parter where you had to load the second part of the episode as a separate program. And again, using artifact colors to have the Enterprise warp into view, and then we'll have the Romulan ship appear and have a little battle. And so they're cloaked, so we'll be firing on empty space, and sure enough there's some kind of shield, and yep, there's the Romulans, using some inversion effects to have them appear, and then they fire a torpedo at the Enterprise, which its shields stop with a fancier explosion than just circles. Oh, the Romulans have zipped away, and we don't know where they're at. We're firing blindly. And then they reappear, and oh dear, they've got a really big weapon that they've fired at us, and it's hit our shields and is destroying the engines and the engineering hull of the Enterprise. And a little different use of the little circles there to show kind of smaller explosions. And then the Enterprise does have enough power left to fire on the Romulans and make a shimmering effect on that explosion with some shifting moves. So some new things we had figured out how to do in BASIC. And there another shimmering effect on that explosion, and then little explosions. So what innovations we could come up with, things we hadn't done before with teamwork here on our final Star Trek adventure that we did together. So I thought it'd be fun to show you the sources of some of those new images that we had used in our program. And Star Trek III, The Search for Spock movie had come out in the summer of '84, and this is the magazine that I had purchased that summer about the movie, and in that magazine was this shot of the Enterprise fleeing space dock with the Excelsior in pursuit, and we used that in our program, and I would use it later in another program called Memento Mori. And that Danubian vessel that was in the program came from this book, the Star Trek Spaceflight Chronology, which had illustrations by Rick Sternbach, who was well known for his work in Star Trek then and beyond, and that was an image taken from that book. And then this shot of the Enterprise firing on the Romulans was taken from this advertisement from that Star Trek III movie magazine. So that's where we got our sources from. Well, that had been the last program that Jeff and I worked on together on Star Trek, but I still had a couple more left in me, and one was this one where I was inspired by Star Trek III, where the new Excelsior class vessel had appeared, and I said, what if we had a battle between it and the Enterprise? So we're working here, drawing in the background the existing old Enterprise ship and then the new Excelsior class, and we're going to have a little battle between them. And the one reason I went ahead and made this program was that I had finally figured out how to repair the damage on a ship from an explosion and not have that delay. There'd always been a delay at the end of an explosion, and then the battle damage would appear, and that always bothered me, and I had figured out how to avoid that. So here they are. We're getting some phaser fire with shields and then a torpedo, and the Excelsior is just too fast for the Enterprise and blew up that torpedo on its way in. And then, oh dear, just a barrage of phaser fire weakening the Enterprise's shields, but it was able to weaken the shield too and get a torpedo in and hit the Excelsior's engine area, and there's that battle damage that's repaired as the explosion occurs rather than have a delay. And then, oh dear, my goodness, they're just blowing up the primary hull of the Enterprise. So she seems like a goner, doesn't she? And of course we couldn't have that, so here's my little torpedo that I aimed through the debris fields at a weak point in the Excelsior so that I could take it out as well and blow up its primary hull. In all honesty, there's no way that the older Enterprise should be able to win against the newer Excelsior, so my strategy was let's just have them hurt each other in a draw. And there we go. So there's only one Star Trek program left. This is probably toward the end of 1984 coming up. Okay, here's the last Star Trek program I wrote on the color computer in late 1984, called Memento Mori. And it was another solo effort, and so I redesigned my intro and just made it my initials and animation of GBM rather than the Omega reduction stuff, and reused that graphic from the previous program, added some titles, and this part I was really proud of. I had found an alphabet in some magazine probably. And I was able to program that into the computer and make this screen in high-res mode and use artifacting for color. Now, it's the only time you're going to see this nicer text in the program, because I needed to use regular text to hide the drawing I was doing in the background for many other shots. But I was really proud that I pulled this off. And so I finally had a decent looking text screen for once. And so we have 2 Constitution class vessels. We're back to regular text mode because I'm drawing stuff in the background. And what I was inspired by was probably the 70s version of Battlestar Galactica, where they had fighters. And so here you see my version of some fighters, kind of like you might see in the Defender video game perhaps, and they're going to a mothership that I drew, which was like a giant carrier. And so that's very different from what you usually saw in Star Trek. You didn't see a lot of this kind of space battle. And so they're watching as these fighters and off this carrier attack a target. And so again, we're drawing something in the background, a new kind of drawing, using my new color capabilities to show this big space station and have not just black and white, but have that kind of orangey red and blue like you saw with the other images. So making full use of that new capability. And some explosions here and different kinds of attacks and sensor overloads. And then, oh my goodness, they really did a number on that, didn't they? And so that was a fun exercise in bringing that high resolution mode to its ultimate limit in the computer's abilities to get 4 colors out of it. And so we've got something going on in the background again, and the Defiant's having some trouble. So, oh dear, another alert. And the mothership is after us. So this is a new drawing being done in the background of what would it look like to have that carrier pursuing us, and I designed it so it looked kind of like a cobra head coming at you to be pretty scary. And we're again drawing something in the background here with the Defiant. Oh, okay, it was a kind of a warping effect of us getting away from that mothership with some colors and circles. And again, drawing something in the background. And what lies in wait but a view of both ships again, but this time I've got this kind of blinking ellipse effect around the one ship that was supposed to indicate it's surging and its shields and a problem. And that was something new I had figured out how to code that I wanted to include in this last go around. And so one of the ships is going to take off, and then here you see a new warp effect with color and a swipe, and that was one more innovation. And then the last thing I'd done is I had gotten a hold of programming that would let me kind of paint on the screen and make images. So I had this moving star field behind the ship was another thing I'd always wanted to do, and then I wrapped it up with a couple of images that I had drawn with this paint program on this fairly primitive computer. And so I made what was an image of what I said was the galactic core, and then I'd also drawn a comet, and so we get to see that. And that brings it to an end. That's the last of my Star Trek programs from 1982 to 1984. Thought I'd wrap up by just showing you a glimpse of some of our other creations from that era. We tried to design a Star Trek game involving the transporter, and we did come up with a layout, and I don't remember much else about it. We just abandoned that project. Another abandoned game project that wasn't Star Trek related was Battleship, and we started laying that out, but then we never really could figure out how to make it make much sense with only one screen on the computer. A game we did fully code in BASIC was this game about a dam with water flow and gates, and you try to avoid flooding a city, and that was fun to put together. And a fairly elaborate game that we designed was a lunar lander type game we called Descent, and that was a lot of fun to put together. We didn't preserve it on the videotape because it probably just didn't even occur to us to record someone playing a game versus watching a program of a narrative play out like the other ones. And this is a non-fiction program I wrote about various space rockets, and it told you information about each one and showed their relative sizes. And I would have a poster along those lines in my physics classroom for many years. And so that'll wrap it up. That's a look back at programs that we wrote on the color computer from 1982 to 1984. And I hope you enjoyed the ride. Take care.